63 days. That is the number standing between the most consequential trade showdown in North American history and a deadline that neither side can afford to miss. On April 27, 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney's government quietly activated a formal advisory committee specifically designed to manage Canada's economic war footing with the United States. Not a task force, not a working group. A structured cabinet-level architecture with representatives from every major sector of the Canadian economy, chaired by Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc himself. That same week, Washington was still waiting for an answer it has not received. The United States asked Canada to sign a bilateral critical minerals agreement separately before CUSMA negotiations even began. A clean deal, a guaranteed supply. Access locked in before Canada could use those minerals as bargaining leverage at the main table. Mark Carney said no, not maybe, not later. No, and I want to be precise about what that refusal actually means, because it is not stubbornness. It is not nationalism. It is a calculated, deliberate, cabinet-level decision that fundamentally reshapes who holds structural power in the next 63 days. Carney is holding Donald Trump's most urgent supply chain request hostage until Trump meets Canada's demands at the main table. That is what we are unpacking today. Stay with me. To understand why Carney's refusal is so explosive, you need to understand exactly what was being asked and when. Let's start with the legal architecture, because this is where most coverage gets lazy. CUSMA, the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, contains a mandatory review clause. Both sides agreed to it when the deal was signed in 2020. That review is now active. The formal deadline is July 1, 2026. But there is a second deadline that almost no one in mainstream coverage is talking about, and it is the one that actually matters first, June 1, 2026. That is the date by which United States Trade Representative Jamieson Greer must deliver a formal report to Congress outlining the administration's intent, whether to extend CUSMA as it currently stands, pursue targeted amendments, or trigger a process that could lead to annual renegotiations. June 1st is not a soft deadline. It is a statutory requirement built into the congressional oversight framework. Whatever signal Greer sends on that date will set the political temperature for everything that follows. Carney's government is aware of this. Ottawa is building its entire timeline around it, and Ottawa is counting on that deadline to generate pressure on Washington before Canada gives an inch. Now let's talk about what Carney is actually refusing to hand over. In March of 2026, at a major international critical minerals conference, the United States Trade Representative's Office presented framework agreements to allied nations. The strategic goal was straightforward: reduce American dependence on Chinese-controlled processing of critical minerals by locking in supply agreements with democratic allies before broader trade negotiations began. NATO has formally identified 12 minerals as essential for modern defense manufacturing. Canada holds reserves of all 12. Canada actively produces 10 of them. These include cobalt, used in jet engine components; nickel, essential for naval vessels and advanced battery systems; lithium, which powers the portable electronics and drone technology the Pentagon is rapidly expanding; and germanium, a material used in night vision systems and fiber optic infrastructure, where China currently controls the dominant share of global processing capacity. The United States Department of Defense recognized this gap directly. It invested $18 million into a Montreal-based company called 5N Plus, specifically to develop a North American germanium supply chain. Washington was already paying to access Canadian supply while simultaneously asking Carney's government to formalize that access on American terms before any broader negotiation began. Most allied nations signed the framework agreements. Mexico signed a bilateral action plan, coordinating its critical mineral trade policies with Washington. Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand delivered a different answer entirely. Her position, communicated clearly to American counterparts, was precise. Any cooperation on critical minerals must occur within the CUSMA review process. Not before it, not beside it, inside it, as an integrated component of the overall deal. Carney's cabinet was not going to gift Donald Trump the one thing his defense planners needed most before Trump had given Canada a single concession in return. Christopher Hernandez-Roy, a defense and trade analyst at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, described Canada's position as strategically sound. In his assessment, Canada had correctly identified critical minerals as significant negotiating leverage and had avoided committing that leverage before sitting down at the main table, a mistake he noted Mexico had already made. Then, on April 27, 2026, Canada's Advisory Committee on Canada-United States Economic Relations convened its first formal session. Every major sector of the Canadian economy represented. The clock officially started. The demand is on the table. The refusal is locked in. Now let me show you what most analysts are missing. Here is where the story gets genuinely interesting. Most coverage frames this as Canada playing defense, a smaller economy holding its breath against American pressure. That framing is not just incomplete, it is structurally wrong. And the evidence is sitting in plain sight. Let's start with Mexico. When Mexico signed its Critical Minerals Action Plan with Washington in March of 2026, it made a choice. Coordinate supply chain policy with the United States before CUSMA negotiations began. Align priorities. Signal goodwill. The diplomatic logic was understandable. Demonstrate cooperation early, build trust, reduce friction. But here is what that choice actually produced at the negotiating table. Mexico arrived at CUSMA discussions having already resolved one of Washington's most urgent asks. The leverage that critical minerals represented, the unmet need, the open question, the active pressure, was gone. Traded away before a single tariff was discussed, before a single concession was extracted in return. Carney watched this happen, and Carney made the opposite decision. That contrast is not symbolic. It is structural. Canada now enters CUSMA negotiations holding something Donald Trump has formally requested and has not yet secured. That is the definition of active leverage, not potential leverage, not theoretical leverage. A concrete, documented, unresolved demand from the most powerful leader on earth, and Mark Carney is refusing to fill it until Trump meets his terms. Now add the second variable, the one that reframes everything. Analysts at RBC Economics noted recently that USTR Greer has signaled it is unlikely that all outstanding CUSMA issues will be neatly resolved by July 1st. What is more probable, according to their assessment, is a partial framework. Core provisions of CUSMA declared intact while more complex issues are routed into parallel working tracks, a rolling negotiation model rather than a clean resolution. If that assessment is accurate, and I want to be clear, this is an analytical projection, not a confirmed outcome, then Carney's strategy of tying minerals to the broader CUSMA framework becomes even more consequential. Because a rolling negotiation means the leverage does not expire on July 1st. It extends. Every month that passes without a minerals agreement is another month the Trump administration feels the pressure of an unresolved supply chain vulnerability that its own Defense Department has flagged as critical. Then there is the third variable, the one Ottawa has been careful not to announce loudly, but has made no effort to hide. In early 2026, Canada engaged in trade discussions with China involving electric vehicles and agricultural exports. Stuart True of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives described this plainly. A more stable relationship with China may function as a signal to Washington that Canada has options and is capable of withstanding pressure. I want to be precise here. Carney is not choosing China over the United States. That framing would be inaccurate. What Canada is doing, according to this interpretation, is making visible the existence of alternatives. And in negotiation theory, the credibility of your outside option is what determines the strength of your inside position. Mexico had no visible outside option when it signed. Carney does. That asymmetry is not accidental. It was built deliberately, and it changes the geometry of everything that follows. Now, here is the part that keeps me up at night. Because everything I have shown you so far, the minerals, the Mexico comparison, the leverage architecture, that is the visible layer. That is what Ottawa wants Washington to see. But underneath it, there is a set of consequences that neither side fully controls. And that is where the real risk lives. Let me show you the first one. The United States Department of Defense has formally acknowledged through the Congressional Research Service that current American strategic reserves would be insufficient to meet estimated critical material requirements in a best-case crisis scenario. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Not a worst-case scenario, a best-case one. The gap between what the American military needs and what it currently holds is not a theoretical planning concern. It is a documented operational vulnerability, and the leader of the country that holds a significant portion of the solution is currently sitting across the table from Donald Trump with his arms folded, demanding concessions before he opens the vault. That creates a pressure dynamic that operates independently of what any trade negotiator says in any meeting room. Defense planners do not wait for diplomatic timelines. They escalate through separate channels, they brief different committees, they create a category of urgency that trade representatives cannot fully contain. Here is what that means in practice. The longer Carney holds minerals inside the CUSMA framework, rather than releasing them into a separate agreement on Trump's terms, the more the Pentagon's institutional pressure begins to work in Canada's favor, not because Ottawa planned it that way, but because the structural reality of American defense requirements generates its own momentum. That is the first unintended consequence. Carney's leverage may be even stronger than Carney himself has publicly claimed. Now here is the second one, and this one cuts the other direction. Canada's strategy only functions if CUSMA itself remains intact. 76% of Canadian exports flow through this agreement. If negotiations collapse entirely, not just stall but collapse, Canada does not walk away holding its minerals as an asset. Canada walks away with its primary export framework dismantled. The leverage is real, but it is conditional. It exists inside a system that Canada also depends on for its economic stability. Carney's refusal is not a cost-free position. It is a high-stakes wager that the agreement itself survives the pressure being applied to it. Most analysts consider full collapse unlikely, but unlikely is not impossible. And the difference between a negotiating masterstroke and a catastrophic miscalculation is often invisible until after the outcome is determined. Here is the third variable, the one I have seen almost no coverage addressed directly. Greer's June 1st report to Congress does not have to be dramatic. He could simply declare that the core of CUSMA remains functional while complex issues require additional time, a procedural continuation, technically compliant, politically low risk. If that happens, the urgency that Carney is counting on, the calendar pressure, the approaching deadline, the political cost to Republican congressmen and manufacturing states, gets quietly diffused without resolving anything. The pressure valve gets released without Canada getting a single concession in return. That is not a conspiracy. That is standard diplomatic procedure, and it is the scenario Ottawa needs to be most prepared for. Carney is betting on the clock, but not every clock moves at the same speed. Let me be your translator. Because what politicians say in formal statements and what those statements actually mean inside a negotiation are two entirely different languages. And the gap between them is where real decisions get made. Start with Anita Anand's statement in March of 2026. The official language was measured, diplomatic, almost bureaucratic. Any discussions about cooperating with the United States on critical minerals must be tied to the review of CUSMA, not before, not separately, inside CUSMA as part of the deal. Now let me tell you what that sentence actually says to a trade negotiator sitting across the table in Washington. It says, "You cannot have what you need until you give us what we want. Full stop." There is no ambiguity in that position. There is no diplomatic softening that changes its operational meaning. Carney's cabinet has attached a condition to a Trump administration request. That condition is the resolution, or at minimum the serious engagement, of outstanding CUSMA issues before any minerals framework is agreed upon. Anand did not say this loudly. She did not need to. In diplomatic language, precision is volume. Now translate Energy Minister Tim Hodgson's statement to Parliament. He said critical minerals are cards in Canada's hand. Most commentators treated this as colorful political language. It was not. It was a public declaration of Carney's negotiating doctrine. When a sitting cabinet minister uses the word cards in a parliamentary context, he is communicating to multiple audiences simultaneously, domestic industry, American counterparts, and international observers that Canada has made a conscious institutional decision to treat mineral access as a tradable asset rather than a baseline assumption. That is a significant shift from how Canada has historically positioned itself in conversations with Washington, and it is Carney's personal imprint. This Prime Minister ran on economic sovereignty. This refusal is that platform made operational. Now let me decode the legal architecture, because this is where the real leverage lives, and almost no one is explaining it clearly. CUSMA's Article 34.7 establishes the joint review mechanism. What it creates is not simply a checkpoint. It creates a window during which either party can formally signal dissatisfaction with existing terms and request renegotiation of specific provisions. Carney has not yet formally invoked this mechanism in its most aggressive form. But the existence of that option, the credible threat of triggering a full renegotiation rather than a technical extension, functions as background pressure in every conversation happening right now. Think of it this way. When you know the other side has the legal right to flip the entire table, you negotiate differently at that table, even if they never actually flip it. Carney's legal team knows this. Trump's legal team knows this. The question is, which side believes the other is genuinely prepared to use it? Now let me show you the political clock inside the American system, because this dimension is almost entirely absent from Canadian media coverage. November of 2026 is the United States midterm election. Every member of the House of Representatives faces voters in roughly 6 months. In Michigan, in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, states where manufacturing employment is directly tied to the cost and availability of Canadian inputs, congressmen are already fielding questions about tariff impacts on their constituents. Some analysts argue, and I want to be clear, this is an interpretive position rather than a confirmed dynamic, that Carney's optimal strategy is not to rush toward a deal before July 1st, but to allow the political cost of delay to accumulate inside the American system. Every week without resolution is a week that Republican representatives in trade-sensitive districts have to defend a policy that is visibly costing their voters. If that analysis is correct, then Carney's most powerful negotiating tool is not Canada's minerals. It is Canada's calendar. Patience, in this reading, is not passivity. It is a form of applied pressure that requires no diplomatic statement, no formal demand, and no public confrontation. But here is the counter-argument that intellectual honesty requires me to present. This strategy assumes that American political pressure translates into negotiating concessions on a timeline that aligns with Canada's needs. That assumption may not hold. The Trump administration has demonstrated a consistent willingness to absorb political friction in trade confrontations for longer than conventional analysis predicted. What looks like unsustainable pressure from the outside has repeatedly proven more durable than expected from the inside. Carney is making a bet on American political pain reaching a threshold before Canadian economic exposure reaches its own threshold. That bet may be correct, it may not be. What I can tell you with confidence is this. The language being used by Carney's ministers is not accidental. The timing of the advisory committee activation is not accidental. The refusal to sign a separate minerals agreement is not accidental. Every piece of this is deliberate, coordinated, calculated. The question is whether the calculation is right. Let me bring this down to ground level, because everything I have walked you through, the legal architecture, the diplomatic language, the negotiating leverage, lives in boardrooms and parliamentary chambers, but the consequences land somewhere else entirely. They land in Sudbury, Ontario, in Thetford Mines, Quebec, in the kitchen of a family in Windsor whose mortgage payment depends on whether the plant down the road keeps its contracts. That is the zoom that matters. So let me make it. Canada's mining and mineral processing sector directly employs tens of thousands of workers across Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia. These are not abstract economic units in a trade model. These are skilled tradespeople, engineers, equipment operators, and logistics workers whose employment stability is directly connected to the certainty of export agreements and investment decisions made at the federal level. When trade frameworks are stable, capital flows into expansion, new shafts get funded, processing capacity gets built, long-term supply contracts get signed. The economic activity radiates outward into equipment manufacturing, into transportation, into the service industries that surround every resource community in this country. When trade frameworks are uncertain, the opposite happens. Investment decisions get deferred. Expansion plans get shelved. Companies do not announce layoffs immediately. That is not how capital works. They simply stop hiring. They delay the next phase. They wait. And communities that depend on that next phase feel the absence of growth before they ever feel an actual cut. That is the realistic near-term risk of Carney's standoff with Trump. Not collapse. Paralysis. Now let me show you the other side of the ledger, because intellectual honesty requires it. If Carney's strategy succeeds, if holding minerals inside CUSMA produces a negotiated outcome that links mineral access to favorable terms on tariffs, on automotive content rules, on softwood lumber, the downstream benefit to Canadian resource communities is significant and durable. A minerals chapter embedded in CUSMA is not just a supply agreement. It is a long-term framework that provides investment certainty for decades, not years. That certainty is what unlocks the capital that builds the processing capacity, that creates the higher value jobs that resource communities have been waiting for. The current situation, where Canadian ore frequently leaves the country for processing elsewhere before returning as finished components, represents a structural gap in Canada's industrial value chain. A successfully negotiated minerals framework has the potential, according to some economic analysts, to begin closing that gap, to bring refining and processing capacity onshore, to move Canada up the value chain from raw material exporter to advanced materials producer. That is the long game underneath the long game. But here is what I need you to understand about the risk sitting between now and that outcome. Canada's export exposure is not evenly distributed. 76% of Canadian exports flow to the United States market. That concentration means that even a partial disruption, not a collapse, just sustained uncertainty, creates asymmetric economic pressure. The Trump administration can absorb a difficult Canadian negotiation as one of many trade files. For Carney, this negotiation is the trade file. That asymmetry does not make Canada's position wrong. It makes the cost of miscalculation higher. A worker at the Sudbury nickel operations does not experience geopolitical leverage. They experience a hiring freeze, or they do not. A family in Windsor does not analyze CUSMA review mechanisms. They watch whether the plant announces a second shift or does not. The distance between Carney's strategy and those lived realities is exactly 63 days long, and it is closing fast. So where does this actually go? I am not going to give you a clean answer because there is not one. Anyone telling you they know exactly how this resolves in 63 days is selling you certainty they do not possess. What I can give you is a rigorous map of the three most plausible paths forward and what each one means for Canada. The first path is structured compromise before June 1st. In this scenario, Greer and LeBlanc reach a framework agreement before the congressional reporting deadline. Critical minerals get embedded into CUSMA as a dedicated chapter rather than a separate bilateral instrument. Carney achieves his core objective, linking mineral access to the broader trade negotiation, and Trump gets supply certainty before the July 1st deadline creates political noise. Both sides claim a win. The leverage gets converted into an actual outcome. This is the path that requires the most political will from both sides simultaneously. It is possible. It is not guaranteed. The second path is technical extension with parallel tracks. Greer reports to Congress on June 1st that the core of CUSMA remains functional and that outstanding issues, minerals, tariffs, sector-specific disputes, will be resolved through dedicated working groups operating alongside the main agreement. The agreement survives. The pressure diffuses. But nothing is actually resolved. Carney retains his leverage in theory, while the urgency that makes that leverage valuable quietly dissipates. This is historically the most common outcome in complex trade negotiations. It is the path of least immediate political pain for both governments. It is also the path that converts a strategic opportunity into a prolonged standoff with no clear resolution timeline. The third path is extended deadlock into the American election cycle. Neither side makes sufficient concessions before the midterm political environment in the United States hardens positions further. The negotiation becomes a domestic political football on both sides of the border. Economic uncertainty for Canadian resource communities extends well into 2027. The leverage Carney preserved either gets converted eventually into a stronger deal, or it gets eroded by time and alternative supply arrangements that Washington pursues in parallel. This is the highest risk path for both countries. 3 paths. 3 very different outcomes for the workers, the communities, and the industries I described a moment ago. Here is the question I want you to sit with. Which of these 3 scenarios do you think is most likely? And more importantly, do you think Mark Carney's decision to hold Canada's minerals hostage until Trump meets his demands was the right call? Or did Carney just raise the stakes on a hand Canada cannot afford to lose? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this kind of analysis, no noise, no panic, just the actual mechanics of how power moves, is what you came here for, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next 63 days are going to move faster than anyone is ready for.